the first meeting of the Safe Yield Technical Group under the Management Plans Work Group. We appreciate you all being here today. My name is Natalie Mast. I am the Program Manager working on the management plans here at ADWR. Just a little bit of clarification about this group. I know I had it on the screen earlier. We don't have defined membership for this group, so anyone is welcome at the table. All of the microphones are at the table, and we do have a webinar going on today, and we're also recording the meeting. So for the benefit of those on the webinar, if you would like to ask a question, make a comment, that kind of thing, please make sure you are speaking into a microphone. And also, again, for the benefit of those on the webinar, when you do speak into a microphone, please identify yourself first. So this is a technical group, so today's meeting is going to be very data heavy. I'm sure you're all very excited about that. So just a few things. We'll be going over how Safe Yield is calculated on an annual basis and some ways that ADWR has looked at it in the past. And then we'll also have a discussion of how we might look at that methodology and other analysis and how we want to structure this group moving forward. A few logistics and kind of ground rules here. So we are hoping for this to be a participatory, a collaborative process. We intentionally kind of left the membership open so that anyone can participate and have a voice in this process. So please do feel free to join us at the table, speak into the microphones. I believe we also have some handheld microphones. For those of you in the back, we have a full house today, which is great. So if you do have a comment, just please do make sure you're speaking into a microphone for those on the webinar. We are hoping to learn from you all. Safe Yield, as you'll see here shortly, is a complicated thing. So we want to be able to learn from the expertise and the knowledge and the skills of those of you in the community who are interested in this. And we want to be able to pull from those that knowledge and that background to be able to figure out how we might move forward with this. So one last thing here, I'm going to try something a little bit different here. So you'll notice that I have this little icon up here. There are going to be a couple times throughout the presentation where I'm going to kind of throw questions out to the crowd where I might want some feedback, some participation, some discussion. So that's just going to be an indication of where we're going to kind of pause for some discussion, where you might be able to provide some input. You are certainly welcome to jump in throughout the presentation if you have questions or particular things you'd like to clarify, but just so you know, there are going to be a couple places where we'll pause for maybe broader discussion. Okay. So for background, for anyone who may have missed the earlier meetings of the Management Plans Work Group, the statute indicates that there should be a management plan for each active management area for each management period. So these plans contain the conservation programs, the mandatory conservation programs that are supposed to be designed to reduce withdrawals of groundwater and to move each AMA toward its goal. So we created the Management Plans Work Group to be a stakeholder forum for the 5th management plans. And this group here today is one subgroup of that work group, and we're going to be focusing specifically on the kind of technical aspects of calculating safe yield. Did I click on something? There we go. Okay. We have heard some questions and confusion about pace and timeline with regard to both the 4th and 5th management plans, so I did want to pause for a second and address those as well. We are at the beginning of kind of a long process to develop the framework that will be used for the 5th management plans for each AMA. We are targeting largely completing the activities of this work group around the end of 2020. This is a very rough timeline at this point. And we're currently, as a part of the work group, kind of focusing on data analysis to better understand the effectiveness of the existing conservation programs. The general idea of this timeline is that we would target having the 5th management plans effective by 2025. So we'll move into the topic at hand today. So again, I've split this into a couple different parts. So first I'll walk through the components of the annual calculation, and then we'll look at some of the data for each of the AMAs to kind of better understand how the characteristics of each AMA influence safe yield, how we analyze it both on an annual basis and on a longer term basis. Those first two pieces will demonstrate many of the challenges in defining and analyzing this thing. And the last part of today's meeting will lay out how we as a group hope to approach those challenges and move into the development of the 5th management plan. So, as we move into this first portion, I will reiterate that 4 out of the 5 AMAs essentially have a safe yield type of goal. So we know that the Pinal AMA's goal is different. To allow development of non-irrigation uses and to preserve the existing agricultural economies as long as feasible. But in that context, we do still want to look at safe yield so that we can kind of use it as a tool, that it can still be instructive in considering water management progress in that AMA. So the definition that we are working with here can be found in the Groundwater Code. Safe yield is a goal that attempts to achieve and then maintain the long-term balance between groundwater withdrawn and recharged in an AMA. So in practice, analyzing this has 2 parts. So we have the annual calculation of safe yield, so the balance of annual water withdrawn and annual recharge, and the analysis of long-term balance with regards to those annual numbers. So what I have on the screen now is that annual portion of the calculation of safe yield. So when I say this is the annual calculation, this is the way the department has interpreted that statute so far. So you can see there's 2 sides to this, inflows and outflows, and both of those sides have 2 components, kind of 2 sections of components, natural and artificial, excuse me. So this calculation is not necessarily a purely physical thing, but is kind of a hybrid of physical and legal factors. So when we look at things like groundwater inflow, streambed recharge, mountain front recharge, most of these types of things, the inflows tend to be kind of physical things. We see canal seepage, cut to the aquifer. These are maybe cut to the aquifer isn't a good example of that. Canal seepage, a lot of these things are physical things where when you get to cut to the aquifer, actually, for example, that's more of a legal thing where cut to the aquifer is the portion of artificial recharge that then gets classified as groundwater and is intended to remain as groundwater. So this calculation does include legally allowable groundwater pumping from various sectors, but does not include does not include water stored underground that is legally classified as another type of water. So, for example, if a city stores effluent, the cut to the aquifer portion of that gets counted as groundwater, gets counted under safe yield, but the effluent portion retains its legal characteristic as effluent and does not get counted as a portion of safe yield. Sure.
Why is the GRD replenishment not, oh, okay, you're not to that.
So it's a fair question, and I can address that anyway. So the GRD replenishment is an offset to groundwater pumping. So that gets included because that water does get legally characterized as groundwater once it's in the ground.
Oh, thanks.
Sure.
Natalie, I have a question.
Sure.
So in that example, if the city elected not to recover the effluent and left it in the ground, would that be counted towards inflow?
Sure. So if they chose to retire those long-term storage credits, in that case, yes. So if those long-term storage credits were no longer a part of someone's account balance, then we could then count that as groundwater. So for the outflow side, we have groundwater outflow, which this is an area where we've realized that our hydrologists and our policy people maybe speak a little bit of a different language. This is intended to mean underflow in between basins, kind of the natural outflow of the groundwater basins. And we also have things, riparian demand under the natural part of outflows. And then this is where you see the biggest part of outflows is kind of the artificial portion. So this is where all of your groundwater pumping under your sectors is. So ag, muni, industrial, tribal, groundwater pumping is all included under this portion of the calculation, as well as poor quality groundwater and remediated groundwater under this side. So any groundwater pumping, this is your physical removing water from the aquifer. Okay. So what I'm showing here is, this is just kind of showing that the data for this calculation comes from multiple sources. So a lot of the inflow side comes from ADWR's regional groundwater models, and a lot of the pumping information comes from annual reports that ADWR receives from the users doing that pumping. So the items here in blue are obtained from the models. The items here in gray are compiled from AMA annual reports. And then there's a couple other things where there might be exceptions where things are estimated or obtained from other types of reports.
That was my question, actually. My GRD question was why my understanding is that CAGRD replenishment is actually in the models. So it's not, wouldn't it be blue? But I also understand that the amount of replenishment that's actually occurring is reported on AMA annual reports, so it would be gray, and it's neither.
I can double check on whether that's in the models. I'm sure it's projected in the models. I'm just not sure it's included in the natural components that I received from hydrology to calculate this.
The last runs of the Phoenix MA designations, is it on?
Maybe.
Maybe? I'll yell. The last designations for the Phoenix AMA included the GRD replenishment in it, and I'm not sure what the status of the Pinal model is, but that was one of the earlier runs in the Pinal model.
That's something I can follow up on. Okay. So a little bit of an explanation of process here. AMA annual reports are due for the prior year at the end of each March. So we received 2018 annual reports at the end of March of 2019. AMA staff then work through data entry, quality checks, and other work to compile and store that data in a number of different ways. The compiled data, that data is then compiled into the various sectors, ag, muni, industrial, and compiled to the AMA level. So that AMA compiled data is used both when ADWR makes our statewide water use estimates, and also that compiled AMA level data feeds into our regional groundwater models. So we target having that AMA level data compilation done by November of each year. So the work in the models to update with that previous year's data happens after that. So that's kind of why there is a lag here. The AMA numbers lag by almost a year, and then the components from the groundwater models will lag even further behind that because of the time and the work involved with making sure those are good numbers. So now that we have, a little bit more of a basis for that annual calculation, we'll go through each AMA one by one and see what that calculation looks like with the particularities of each AMA. So we'll go through a couple ways that we've looked at long-term safe yield for each AMA and illustrate what it is I mean when I say this is a really complicated thing to analyze and to understand. So I know this is a little bit hard to see, so I'll describe it here. On the left side, you have a breakdown of total water demand by sector over time. So orange is municipal, gray is industrial, and green is agricultural. And on the right side, we have ag, muni, industrial, but this is a breakdown of the water types that they use. Excuse me. So yellow is groundwater, blue is surface water, and the purple here is reclaimed water. So the Prescott AMA in this first example has seen significant growth in its municipal sector over time, while its agricultural water has decreased. You can also see here that groundwater makes up a significant portion of the Prescott AMA's total supply, but Prescott's portfolio does have a higher proportion of effluent as a part of its portfolio, which they have really worked to increase over time. So this graph is, you remember I talked about the inflows, outflows. This line is just what that calculation looks like graphed out over time. So down here, below the line is net recharge. Above the line is net overdraft, or what is coming out. So you can see here that this is a wildly variable thing over time. And just looking at this can be really hard to pick out any influences or trends that we see over time. So here we've added in that same overdraft line with groundwater pumping from each sector. So your orange here is municipal, gray is industrial, it's just a little tiny bar, and agricultural is green. So what you can see here is you can track that increase of municipal over time, and you can see the decrease of agricultural over time here. In this example, though, there's not really an apparent correlation between overdraft and those groundwater demands, those pumping demands. So when we replace just the pumping side with the two sides of the calculation that I showed earlier, you have inflows on top and outflows on the bottom. You can see that this particular AMA is really driven by the inflows. So again, the top part of the graph is outflows, bottom is inflows. So you can see overdraft here is kind of the middle point of those bars. So depending on the balance of those bars each year, your overdraft is kind of all over the place. But you can see that overdraft is really driven by these years of very high recharge that are kind of intermittent and unpredictable in this particular AMA. So you'll see when we get to this chart for other AMAs that these inflow-outflow patterns for Prescott are really unique to this AMA, where it's so kind of unpredictable with these very large swings in it. So this is still just looking at the annual calculation, though, and under the statute, we also need to look at this on a long-term basis. So this is that same overdraft line again, but what we have here is also two trend lines. So this blue trend line is for the full time period. This yellow trend line is for just the last 20 years of that time period. And when you graph out Prescott's annual overdraft over time, so again, it's wildly variable. It's hard to pick out a general trend, but the full-time period trend line is increasing, while this 20-year trend line, while it's still certainly in a state of overdraft, seems to be that the rate of that overdraft is decreasing over time over the last 20 years. So this can be useful, this can be instructive, but it doesn't necessarily tell the whole story and might really just reflect the luck of the draw of the years that they're covering rather than exposing any underlying trends, because this is such a variable system. So again, looking at this data in a different way, this might tell a little bit of a different story, where we'll see this again and again as we go through the AMAs, that one single chart really isn't enough to accurately reflect the state of each AMA. So this chart has replaced those trend lines with a running average. So what you see here is that the average overdraft has been slightly increasing on average over the last 20 years, which is kind of the opposite of what that other trend line told us. So we really have kind of, if you look at this in a simplistic way, you can really come up with conflicting explanations about what's going on in the AMA. So I'm going to run through that same series of charts with the other AMAs and lay out some of the differences between them. But does anybody have any questions before I move on? Mr. Krupa.
Natalie, I have a question about the, if you can go back to, I think, slide 17. So you're talking about, I mean, these large inflow amounts in those certain years are due to just high precipitation events and runoff and recharge, natural recharge that's occurring. And it's unpredictable everywhere in Arizona. I wouldn't think that the Prescott AMA is any different than any other AMA, because we don't, you know, we can't predict when large amounts of natural recharge are going to occur anywhere in the state.
So when we get to this slide for some of the other AMAs, we can use that as an example. So what you'll see for the other AMAs is that the swings don't tend to be quite as wide with the other AMAs, and that they, I guess the differences between the flood years don't tend to be quite as much, and that the flood years are a little. Yeah, we can look at the pattern when we get to another AMA rather than me trying to describe it inelegantly. But we'll certainly come back to that, I think.
And then on slide, maybe it's the next one or the one after that one right there. So what is that yellow line?
So the yellow line is just a trend line for only the last 20 years of data there, rather than being a trend line for the full time period of data.
And then the blue dots are the same linear, but just over the entire.
That's correct.
30 years?
Yes.
Okay.
Natalie, can you put on that other slide that I brought?
Oh.
While you're doing it, I'm Dr. Peter Krupnik with the Citizens Water Advocacy Group out of Prescott. This is a plot very similar to what Natalie's been showing. Certainly the bars across the top are identical. That data comes out of the Fourth Management Plan with the last couple of years added. But what I've put on here is the cumulative. As you can see, plotted on the same scale. What's in the Fourth Management Plan is they changed the scale for the cumulative. It sort of minimizes the deficiency, shall we say. When plotted the same scale, you see we're heading for China. Yeah, there's a couple years where we've had a little net recharge, but the overall overdraft is terrible. And I mean, the goal is to reach a balance. And I'm here to ask somebody tell me how we're ever going to get back to balance with trends like that. We can come to what we're using these management plans for maybe at the end, but the point is we have to get to mandatory conservation.
Sure.
Natalie, can you go back to your other slide?
Sure.
Let's go to 18 maybe. Sorry.
So I think what Dr. Krupnik is saying is that there's concern about us not currently being at a state of safe yield, and that's a fair concern. But what we're trying to do here is really have a discussion of what are the ways we calculate safe yield. Is there a way we can better understand and communicate the status of each AMA with regards to safe yield, and really understand the things that are driving that safe yield, so that we can get to those policy conversations about how we address it. So yes, I think we'll get there, but it's going to take a little legwork to get there.
I'm just trying to point out the importance of getting these calculations right and going forward with them.
Yes, agreed. Thank you.
Can you go back? Maybe it's one more slide back.
Sure.
So in 93, we have probably 45,000 acre-feet of recharge and about 20,000 acre-feet of, or a little over 20,000 acre-feet of pumping. So a net positive of a little over 25 or close to 25.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And I was just comparing his, the doctor's graph, which was a little bit lower, but it's close.
Oh,
okay. All right. Yeah, 93 was a really wet year throughout the area.
Right, and you will see that spike of 93 in pretty much all of the AMAs. So, all right, moving on. So we'll move on to the Phoenix AMA here. Again, I'll go through that same sequence of slides for each of the AMAs, and you'll kind of, again, start to see a little bit of a picture of the complexity here and how maybe an analysis that seems to tell a story for one AMA doesn't really work with a different data set. So the Phoenix AMA contains 60% of the state's population by itself. This represents about a third of the state's total water use. Groundwater use in this AMA has actually decreased slightly since the early 90s, but largely water use in this AMA has been relatively flat despite the AMA nearly doubling its population in this time period. So again, you have municipal, industrial in gray, tribal water use in pink, and agricultural water use here. And then over on the right side, we have agricultural water use, tribal water use, municipal, and industrial, with groundwater in yellow, surface water in blue, Colorado River water in red, and reclaimed water in purple. So you can kind of see that all of the sectors in this particular AMA rely on multiple sources of water for the supply. The portfolio in this AMA is diverse and not necessarily disproportionately reliant on one source. So again, we have that annual overdraft chart. Again, you see this kind of wild variability over time. It's hard to pick out particular trends. So when we add in groundwater demands by sector to that graph, it actually appears that the amount of overdraft on an AMA scale for Phoenix is relatively small as compared to groundwater. So overdraft is relatively small as compared to total groundwater demands each year in the Phoenix AMA. But this one second, sorry. So this may be where we discover another weakness or difficulty with these types of analysis, where when we look at averages on the AMA scale, it might mask some more localized areas of concern. Go ahead.
I assume it does, but does agricultural groundwater include in lieu water delivered to GSF?
Yes. So in that case, in lieu water delivered to GSF, that gets classified in the year that it is applied to the ground, yes, because the water that is then stored underground is no longer classified as, legally classified as groundwater. Okay. So what you can see here is municipal is your orange bars, industrial and tribal water use are down here, industrial in gray and tribal in pink or purple, and then the ag is the green bars up here. So. All right. So when we look at total inflows and outflows for the Phoenix AMA, you can see here that the inflow side is much more consistent in this particular case. You have some kind of little bumps in some wetter years, but it doesn't have those same very, very large swings that Prescott seems to. So variability in the Phoenix AMA seems to be more driven by the, so this seems to be driven more by the outflow side, although again the kind of quantity of overdraft in this AMA is much smaller. So it's a little more predictable, and the gap maybe doesn't appear to be quite as big for the Phoenix AMA in particular. So here's where the picture might not be as rosy, though, when we try to look at this more on a long-term basis. So again, the blue line is a trend line for the full time period, where the yellow line is for just the last 20 years. So where it looks like the rate of overdraft has been pretty flat over the full time period, we actually show increasing overdraft over the last 20 years for this particular AMA. So it's moving. So according to this, it would appear to be moving further away from where it should be. So it's complex. A single chart may not necessarily tell the full story that we want to tell with regard to any given AMA. So the running average here shows that the Phoenix AMA has probably come a little bit closer to safe yield over time, but that trend has been maybe a little inconsistent. There have been some bumps along the way, and the most recent years of this analysis do show that the AMA is moving further into overdraft. So maybe that's, again, consistent with that last trend line that I showed. So I'll move on to the Pinel AMA. The Pinel AMA does not have a safe yield goal, again, but it can be instructive to analyze overdraft with regards to the AMA, just to better understand water management progress in that AMA. So the Pinel AMA's water supply was a little bit over, whoops, I lost my mouse, there we are, a little bit under half groundwater in 2017, but we do anticipate that this proportion of groundwater is going to grow in coming years in response to expected changes in renewable supplies there. So this chart on the right here could very well look different in coming years. We do see that, whoops, so this does look a little bit different than the others. You'll see, again, some variability, but you also see, as Dave pointed out earlier, that 93 year being kind of an extreme flood recharge year. That appears to be a little bit anomalous with the other years in the graph. So we do see, so again, we have the groundwater demands in this chart. We do see that the overdraft in this AMA seems to mirror changes in pumping, though. So here you see a change in agricultural pumping between 2010 and 2011. And you can see that reflected in the overdraft chart. So the overdraft in this particular AMA seems to be pretty responsive to the demand side of things, the outflow side of things. And again, you can kind of see that same thing in the inflows and outflows chart, that it seems to respond more to changes in outflows. Although that might be a slight correlation, and it's hard to draw any strong trends here. So you'll see that the trend lines here are unique for Pinel in that both the blue full-time period and the yellow 20-year trend line show increasing overdraft with an even higher rate, an even higher rate of overdraft in the more recent years as compared to the long-term history. But this is another case where a different analysis might show some conflicting information. So the running average chart seems to kind of clarify things for Phoenix and Prescott, but here it serves to confuse things a little bit. So basically, because Pinel had this 1 year of kind of anomalous extreme flood recharge, it skews this running average to something closer to safe yield, despite over 500,000 acre feet of cumulative overdraft and known groundwater issues across this AMA. So moving on to the Tucson AMA. The Tucson AMA is unique for a lot of reasons, but part of the reason that we often say Tucson might be a bit of a success story is due to the change in groundwater reliance over time. So in 1991, this AMA's supply was 97% groundwater, and as of 2016, that was down to about 55%, due in large part to the availability of Colorado River supplies in that AMA. So you also don't see significant changes in water use as broken down by sector over time in this AMA, whereas it's easier to see some trends in other AMAs. So the Tucson AMA's overdraft chart is kind of an interesting one. So again, you have that large spike of recharge in 1993, similar to Pinal. But rather than seeing the rest of the chart kind of going back to business as usual, being relatively variable, you can actually see this nice, clear declining trend over time. When we look at overdraft overlaid with the groundwater demands in this AMA, you can see municipal pumping and agricultural pumping and industrial, and the industrial and agricultural seem to be pretty flat, where those municipal groundwater demands track really cleanly with that kind of decline in overdraft over time. So again, this correlation isn't the same in every AMA, but you can see here what I mean when I say that each AMA has its own particularities, a little bit of its own flavor. So we do have some variability in inflows in this AMA, not to the degree that we saw in Prescott. But what you see here is kind of a narrowing of these bars over time as they get closer to some kind of a long-term balance. So you can see that the bars kind of seem to be closer together as they move more towards 2016 at the end. So while I've talked about these graphs not really necessarily telling the whole story, what we see here for Tucson is pretty clear that even the full trend line for Tucson seems to be declining, going down closer to safe yield, and that rate of moving towards safe yield in the more recent years in the 20-year trend line is really much faster, more significant. And Tucson is the one AMA where we've felt pretty comfortable saying that this AMA is likely close to or at safe yield. But again, mixed bags. So again, in Tucson, the running average doesn't seem to match the rest of the story. Because Tucson had these high overdraft years kind of at the beginning of the time period, this running average overdraft line is skewed higher as compared to when you look at the more recent years. So if we were to do maybe a running average of just 2005 to 2015, we might see something flatter, closer to safe yield. But since this particular line includes all of the years, it gets skewed a little bit higher. So finally, we have the Santa Cruz AMA. So this AMA is very nearly entirely groundwater dependent. So this yellow is groundwater. You can see that all three sectors use almost exclusively groundwater. But historically, because this AMA had relatively low total demands, they were pretty close to safe yield. So this AMA is unique in that the water demands do seem to have a little bit of a greater variability over time, at least in the agricultural sector, possibly showing some kind of a response to annual water availability and hydrologic conditions to a greater degree than in other AMAs. So we'll show that, again, the annual overdraft chart. Again, we see that this is super variable, hard to pick out any obvious trends. And Santa Cruz, that overdraft graphed out again with groundwater demands. What we see here is the groundwater demands are relatively flat, but the variability of this, sorry about that, the variability of overdraft in this particular AMA kind of outpaces those groundwater demands. So there's not really any visible correlation between overdraft and changes in pumping patterns in this particular AMA. Oops. There we go. So when we shift to the inflow and outflow view, while what we see here is, again, that story of pretty constant outflows, that's relatively flat over time, there is quite a bit of variability, again, kind of in the supply side and in the inflow side of this particular graph. And you can see in this AMA more than the others kind of the impacts of drought, where you can see that the more recent years are much lower than the earlier time period. So, and this bears out something that we've heard before, that this particular AMA may be more sensitive to drought-type conditions than some of the others. Okay. So the trend lines here do show increasing overdraft over time, so both the full time period and very slightly upward on the 20-year, although the 20-year trend line is relatively flat, maybe showing that this kind of increase over time has flattened out more recently. So, and in this case, the moving average kind of seems to match the other analysis here, matching the trend lines, moving from safe yield in the earlier time period to a condition of increasing overdraft, flattening more recently, kind of showing that sensitivity to drought in this particular AMA. Excuse me. So, ADWR is working hard to be transparent throughout this process, through the workgroup process, through these meetings. One way we are doing that is these meetings for these conversations, so we do appreciate such a good turnout today. In addition to that, we will be publishing the results of the workgroup analysis in this conservation progress report. This report will include analyses of the conservation programs in all three sectors, and also will contain an analysis of progress toward the goals for each of the AMAs, for all 5 AMAs. So it's our intent that this report is kind of piggybacking on another report that ADWR is required by statute to do. So the intent is that this full report would be published at least every 3 years. So for further transparency, the compiled data that is used to analyze safe yield is published on the AMA data page on our website. That page does have an interactive dashboard displaying AMA water supply and demand data in an interactive format with a downloadable data set, as well as with spreadsheets containing additional supply and demand information, and the detailed calculation for the annual analysis of safe yield for each year. So that same kind of inflows, outflows thing, that calculation is built into the spreadsheets that are posted on the AMA data page. So this might be a very long-winded and overly detailed way of saying that safe yield is complicated. It's complex. There's not a good way of saying this AMA is this many acre-feet away from safe yield, because it's kind of a moving target. There are a lot of different ways we can look at this to better understand it. But there are also a lot of interconnected components and factors that influence it, and factors that might influence the story we might want to tell about each AMA. So to recap a little bit, since I have thrown a whole lot of information at you, the annual calculation of safe yield is highly variable. We are working with a somewhat vague definition when it comes to both the annual calculation and the components that we include there, and also when it comes to that long-term balance and trends and how we analyze those. And at least so far, we have not identified a single way of looking at this that can paint a full picture of the status of each AMA across the AMAs. So all of these kind of interconnecting things make this a particularly difficult thing to define, to analyze, to communicate in any kind of a clear or definitive manner. So if I've learned anything digging into all of this, it's that every detail of this is complex. So I'm sure that there are additional challenges that'll come up over the course of our conversations here, and I'm looking forward to learning from all of you and potentially hearing different approaches to this. So before we move too far past the data slides, does anybody have any questions or comments so far on the data or what the challenges are when it comes to analyzing or communicating safe yield? Excuse me. Any questions? No? I did too good of a job, and you all understand it perfectly.
I have a couple of questions for you, Natalie.
Thanks, Dave.
You know, in our comments on this, we suggested that you have to take a look at this over a fairly long period of time and not just during a fairly short period of time. You know, the yellow lines that you have on your charts are all during a very dry period here in Arizona. And when you go back another 10 or 15 years, it was a wetter time, and so you capture the wet period. So if you take a look at it on as too short of a time, you may be making decisions during a wet period, or you may be making decisions during a dry period. And so I think you got to balance those out. And the work that we've done with the U of A shows that cycle is a pretty long period of time. So whatever we need to do, we need to take a look at that, because we don't want to be making decisions during a dry period or making decisions during a long-term decision during a wet period either.
Sure, and I definitely understand that, and that's kind of why I wanted to show those full-time period versus maybe the smaller time period lines, showing that in some cases, it really can be kind of luck of the draw with which years you choose. It can kind of paint a different picture depending on what your frame of reference is there.
I mean, this is sort of like a bank account. You have withdrawals and you have deposits, and the rolling average, from our perspective, tends to tell the best story as opposed to a linear, just a direct linear graph. Because it takes into account those wet periods when you have more deposits and the dry periods when you have more withdrawals.
Sure. And I think maybe with the example of Tucson, the rolling average might not have, it masks a little bit when you've made significant progress, have made significant reductions over time. So it's maybe a little more complex than just
Tucson has made progress, but if you looked at the dry period they had, which is really when they didn't have CAP water and they were pumping, then obviously they were way overdraft. But the CAP water has really made a big difference in that AMA, and that will continue to go in that direction, I think, for quite a long time.
Right. I think we got to look at the overall trend here as we move into warmer, drier climates in the future, and get together more with the climatologists down at U of A and see how long, are we going to stay dry, or is it cyclic?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry about that. Just a reminder, as you guys are speaking, to please say your name before your comment for the people on the webinar. Thank you, McKenna. Pam.
Pam Hughes from the State Land Department. I don't think I heard you mention this, Natalie, when you were going through all of the data components into the calculation of safe yield, but some of those components are lagged. So some of the things happen in that particular year, but for example, the incidental recharge from agriculture is lagged. So that's from farming that occurred some time ago, that water is finally making its way into the aquifer. And on the GRD has 3 years to replenish pumping that occurred in a given calendar year. So on their report that they send to DWR, they have an obligation to get some water in, but there's a sort of a lag there too. So I just wanted to point that out.
Right. Thank you, Pam. That's a really good point. And that is something I'd like to have a conversation about through this group, and maybe just introducing it today is a good way to go about that. Some of these components are calculated or generated differently from each other or differently across AMAs. So Pam made the point of the agricultural recharge being lagged. The industrial and municipal recharge, the incidental recharge from those sectors is not lagged. So maybe that's something we want to at least have a conversation about. Do we try to be consistent about those things across the board? How do we approach this kind of from a policy perspective, understanding that it's not a purely physical thing, that it's not a purely policy thing? Thank you, Pam. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. So I've put a couple goals for this group up on the screen, excuse me. And maybe this is just a start for goals for this group. And I would like to hear from all of you regarding whether I've missed anything here. So the first thing I kind of identified that I would like for this group to do is have a conversation about that methodology. So are the components included in the annual calculation the correct components? Are we using the correct data set for each of those components? Is there a way we can look at this consistently across the AMAs in terms of both that annual calculation and in terms of analyzing it on a long-term basis? And maybe especially with that last question, maybe the answer is no. But if there is some approach to consistency, or if we can find some consensus on how we might approach this thing, I think it'll take us a long way to better communicating Sayfield and better communicating the status of each AMA with regards to Sayfield. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts on the goals for this group, or anything that I might have left out here? Sarah?
Sarah Porter from the Kyle Center. I understand the need for consistency across AMAs, but inevitably there are going to be variations that you have to account for to tell the story. And so I wouldn't want to get too hung up on wanting to have so much consistency. So.
And I would tend to agree with that. I think what I've laid out here today is maybe a good demonstration showing that consistency across the AMA is a nice thing that we could potentially have, but that the AMAs are different enough from each other that maybe that's not a reasonable thing, that maybe we need something unique to each AMA to really tell its story. Yeah.
Peter Krupnik again. Just want to point out the AMA is a political boundary as opposed to the basins. And maybe these calculations need to be done on a individual basin basis.
And that is something that's come up from time to time, some considerations of doing this maybe on a sub-basin type level rather than across the entire AMA. ADWR has typically looked at it on the AMA scale because that's how the statute defines it, but that doesn't preclude us from also analyzing it on a sub-basin level, and I think that could be really instructive. And I think I talked earlier about how some of these things might mask more localized groundwater level declines. Some of that sub-basin type analysis might unmask some of that. Sure. Okay. Anybody else? Great. Okay. So some of this has already been touched on. but I did just kind of want to go over a couple things on potential analyses, things this group might look at over the course of this group. So again, kind of our open questions here are, with annual overdraft, are the components that we listed, are these the right components? Are there things we're missing? Are there things, I'll double check on the CAGRD thing, are there things that we're potentially double counting? That's totally a possibility. We'll look into that. So we'd like to do an assessment of, are these components the right components? Are there things we're missing? And then to Pam's point, is the data source for each component the best source, with some of them being lagged, some of them not being lagged? Should we have consistency kind of internal to the calculation between components, that kind of thing? And then moving past that, past the annual overdraft, how do we quantify long-term overdraft? How do we say where each AMA is with relation to safe yield, with relation to overdraft? How do we communicate where each AMA stands with relation to this goal? So I know there have been a number of other groups who have looked at safe yield over time. I think obviously it would be great to be able to learn from some of them. There are also similar concepts out there in other states. There's other definitions out there of safe yield. There might be worthwhile things that we could learn from other entities, other groups. I'm sure there are things out there that I have not heard of yet. So again, we really do want this to be a collaborative and interactive process. We would really love to learn from all of you, learn from your knowledge and experience, and be able to move this conversation forward in a really productive manner. And then once we kind of get to better understanding how we might analyze this, maybe someone is better at statistics than I am and can help us understand how there might be ways to understand the individual components, look more at projections and smoothing things and understanding what the actual underlying influences might be. So we're certainly interested in having a pretty technical conversation about this. Like I said, the data is all posted online, so we would certainly love for all of you to be digging into that data, having other people doing analysis with this data and seeing if there's things that other people, other entities can dig out of that data that they'd be willing to share with us. So does anybody have any questions or comments on that portion? Okay. Great. So I'll go ahead and so the last thing I have for today is just wrapping up a little bit. So as I mentioned, this is intended to be a participatory process. We really do appreciate you all coming out today. I'm really thrilled to see such good turnout for what is a pretty data-heavy topic. So I am interested in hearing from all of you on next meetings. How frequently should this group meet? When should we meet next? Are there other topics or data sources that we should discuss in some detail? Or are there data sources that I might have missed? Or are there additional analyses or anything like that that we should be considering as a part of this group? Excuse me. So does anybody have any thoughts, limitations, ideas on how frequently this group should meet, when we should schedule our next meeting for? And that would be okay. All right. Okay, seeing none, that's fine. So we're I don't know about that, but I've apparently been very thorough.
Safe yield. We've attempted to meet safe yield. We're there. We're there.
Yeah, if Dave Roberts, if the analysis is only attempt, we've done a good job.
Great. All right, so what I would propose, so we have our next full work group meeting on December 4th. good thing I put it on the slide because I was not remembering that date. So our next full work group meeting is on December 4th. I will talk internally with our people and get some kind of a proposal together regarding a next meeting for this group. But for this particular group, I think we'll probably just plan to have our next meeting after that next full work group meeting. So, does anybody have any final questions or comments before we wrap up today? Okay. Great. Well, I really do appreciate everyone being here today. I really appreciate everyone's participation and attention on a kind of dense topic here. Please do feel free to reach out to us anytime if you have any questions or comments. We have an email address set up specifically for these conversations. It's managementplans@azwater.gov. And we appreciate you all being interested. Thank you for your time today. Thanks.